We just saw with our syntax, we're using HTML to describe the content that we're adding to the experience. Now, this idea of describing, of providing that contextual information about what this content means is encapsulated in the term semantic HTML. So modern developers, that's how they think about this topic because it's a spectrum of we can be kind of vague and less descriptive, all the way up to we can be extremely descriptive about what this piece of information is in our HTML. And as designers, we're kind of familiar with this debate or this idea when it comes to naming our layers. So let's take a look at this example here. We've got one component, they're the same component, but with different names. And we've kind of used the Figma defaults. We've got frame 4, frame 3, lunch, draft. It's just the text content, the ellipses vertical, right? Like, we're all guilty of this, me especially. I've got this a little bit more polished because I'm sharing it, but we're going fast, we're not using a design system, we're a team of one or two, and it doesn't really matter that we name our layers that much, and that's perfectly fine for these use cases. But we start working with a larger team, we need a design system, all of a sudden, it becomes much more beneficial if we get a little bit more semantic, get a little bit more descriptive with our layers, and actually name them things that make sense and are a little bit more descriptive of what should go in here, especially with our components. When we say this is the title, it's not always going to be lunch, it could be dinner, it could be something else, but this should always be a title as we talk about this component. This is the same thing that's happening for developers. Back in the 90s, in the early days of HTML, it was sort of the Wild West. An element could be anything. And so what you had is different teams would have different cards, and one would call this a card, one would call this a section, one would call this an aside, and you had all these different terms for all these different elements, and nobody could change teams. People couldn't understand what other people's HTML was doing, and you had all this confusion brewing. So what happened was you had this group come together and they started to say, okay, we're going to get really prescriptive. We're going to say that instead of headings or titles or anything like that, the most important piece of content on the page will be an H1, we'll have an H2, an H3, and so on and so forth. And they defined what all the elements were and what they would mean when we're describing the content. So all this debate and this concept and this discussion of what are we actually calling our elements and how are we using them to describe our information is bundled into this idea of semantic HTML. And just like us as designers, as you'll see, you can be more vague, you can not be so super descriptive, or you can be extremely descriptive with HTML. Generally speaking, we want to be as descriptive as possible. That has many benefits for accessibility, for SEO, even just for the next developer who comes along and wants to read the code and understand what's going on. If we're more descriptive, we're going to give them more of an understanding of what we're trying to accomplish with the HTML, versus if we're just using frame 4 or frame 3 and being vague, they're not going to really understand what we're talking about. They have to infer it and guess, and there can be some miscommunication there. So this idea that our usage of HTML operates on a spectrum of semanticness, basically, and we want to be as semantic as possible when writing our code.